That's right. Today I'm going to talk about the early tectonic history of the Eastern Goldfields. Basically, the Eastern Goldfields, you see this very strong north-northwest trending structural grain made up of the greenstone belts and these anastomosing shears that wrap around a series of granite bodies. And for a long time, that sort of structural grain was thought to be the result of accretion and strong compression during amalgamation of these terranes. But recent studies, particularly stratigraphic studies, suggest that perhaps a terrane accretion model is not the best way to describe the development of the Eastern Goldfields. And also in the Leonora area and in Laverton, there's a much older 2800 million year sequence, which is similar in age to some of the you and me sequences. And it's paraconformably overlain by the younger sequences, this sort of Kalgoorlie age sequence that overlies it, suggesting that the older sequence is not tilted or deformed prior to deposition of the younger greenstones. And recent work by Martin Gold has shown large areas of this older stratigraphy exists in the Agnew-Molina belt. So they're not just isolated exposures. There's quite a lot of this older stratigraphy underlying the dominant greenstone sequences. And I think one of the most important clues for the early tectonic history of the Eastern Goldfields is the late basin sediments. These are clastic sequences that unconformably overlie the greenstones right throughout the Eastern Goldfields. And I mean, you can see them, they sit right up there, they're unconformably overlying, they're similar aged across the Eastern Goldfields. So I think that's telling us that they are forming in response to a regional tectonic process, not just some local tectonics. And the clastic sequences that you find in the lake basins tend to grade up from mafic-ultramafic clasts at the base of the sequence, right up into siliciclastic and granitic clasts at the top of these sequences. And what they are recording is the uplift and exhumation of the granite domes, and with that eroded detritus raining into these little basins. And interestingly, and I look at a lot of these clasts in the basins because I work for Goldfields and we have 3 lake basins that our deposits are hosted in. The clasts don't contain any internal deformation fabrics. We don't see schist, we don't see gneissic clasts. It's just, these are very typical of what we see, hyperbissal sort of clasts. And so, I mean, a lot of the uplift of the granite domes was thought to be happening during amalgamation with compression, squeezing up these sort of granite domes so that they could be exposed to erode into these basins. But if that was the case, where are the gneissic and schistose clasts in these basins? And also, in addition, we've got that paraconformity between the older sequence and the younger sequence, which tells us, you know, things have been very quiet in the Eastern Goldfields for a very long time. And the first significant angular unconformities are actually only seen until you get to the upper part of the Black Flag Formation and at the base of the lake basins. And most field-based structural studies recognise the strong east-west compression. The onset of that is the D2 event or D4A event of Blewett and Carlotta's work. And after that, most of the deformation sequences are fairly similar. It's prior to the strong compression event, the D1 event, where things get very confused. The D1 event has been variably described as extensional or compressional. But mainly because there's not a lot of outcrop and that overprinting deformation is so strong. But the key feature with the D1 fabrics is they're very similar right through the Eastern Goldfields. You see a layer parallel S1 fabric and recumbent F1 folds. And these fabrics are consistently overprinted by the east-west compressional event. You see upright F2 folds overprinting the D1 fabrics. So there is some consistency there. And in this talk, I'm going to sort of travel around the Eastern Goldfields, looking at sort of deformation relationships in the different areas, just to sort of show what the relationships are. And to do this, I've just simplified the stratigraphy into the main sequences. The older sequence, the 2800 million sequence at Leonora and Laverton, is in dark green and dark purple. The other paler green and purple ultramafics, that's part of the dominant sort of 2700 million-year greenstone sequences that we see throughout the Eastern Goldfields, with the pale brown being the intermediate to felsic volcanics and volcano-clastics, the Black Flag Formation down in Kalgoorlie. And then overlying in the dark brown are the lake basins that we see scattered through the Eastern Goldfields. And before I go to different districts, I'll just have a quick mention about the metamorphic pattern that we see in the Eastern Goldfields. And this is work done in the early 80s by Binns et al. And they just show that the metamorphic isogrades, the highest grade rocks, are actually wrapping around the granite domes, and the lowest metamorphic grades are seen in the centre of the greenstone belts, as you can see through here. And this is not contact metamorphism, because those metamorphic isogrades wrap around composite granitic bodies. So they're basically, yeah, it's more recording an uplift event. So the deepest rocks, obviously around the outside edges of the granite bodies, are the highest metamorphic grades, with the rocks that have not risen so much are in the central parts of the greenstone belts. And recent work by Ben Goscombe has also identified that the highest pressure rocks tend to be within these granitic complexes, which is also suggesting that they've come up, they've risen the most. They've certainly been the deepest rocks. So now we'll just go to the Leonora District to start with. And D1 fabrics in the Leonora area are probably the best preserved in the Eastern Goldfields. We see the large Sunday shear zone is a large D1 extensional shear that wraps around the race-side batholith. But we also see further to the south, we see large F1 folds in the younger sequence coming through here. And what I'll do, I'll just show you some photos from the Gwalia Pit, Tower Hill and Harbour Lights. And then I'll also show some images from the Tarmula Pit, or the King of the Hills. And in the Gwalia Pit, this is the Gwalia, Sunday Gwalia shear zone. It's a 500 metre wide mineralistic zone. It's huge. And if you look in the pit walls, right down by the portal there, you can see extensional kinematics within the shear zone. This is the shear in the Tower Hill pit. So there's the granite that sort of sits underneath the shear. You've got this big broad myelinite zone. You can see, as you can see, it's a really strong fabric in the overlying ultramafic units. And the same shear and further north in the Tower Hill pit, basically the race-side batholith just sits in the footwall of the pit there, and this huge shear zone is just sitting in the hanging wall. And if you look across at that face there, you see these beautiful large recumbent folds in the shear zone. And if we go over here and we look at the shear in detail, beautiful extensional kinematics and mineral lineation, stretching lineations straight down dip. So it's pure extension. Now, if we go further north to the Tarmula pit, or it's King of the Hills underground operations here, there's the Tarmula trondhjemite, and you can see this, the S1 fabric is the dominant fabric here, and you can see it's parallel to bedding. There's some siltstone there. Again, there's bedding there and the dominant fabric here. It is overprinted by later deformation, but it's still the dominant fabric in this area. And just down the road at Jasper Hill, the S1 fabric again is the dominant feature, but it's clearly folded by upright north trending F2 folds. And you can see a beautiful L1 stretching lineation on the S1 surface. And this is the S1 surface here. That's the L1 stretching lineation. That's the trace of S2 cutting across those early fabrics. So it's a really common feature that the D1 fabrics are always overprinted by those upright north trending folds. And timing-wise for D1 fabrics, originally I would have thought they were really old fabrics and we'd see them only in these older units, but they're not. What we see is F1 folds developed in that younger greenstone sequence. So it has to be younger than 2680, but also the Pigwell Graben, which is one of those lake basins, actually truncates some of the F1 folds. So it's giving us sort of a window that it's somewhere just before and after deposition of the Pigwell Graben. Now we'll go across to the Agnew District, just further to the west. Again, there's another lake basin. This is the Scotty Creek Basin, and a series of D1 shears with extensional kinematics wrap around the Agnew granitic complex. The largest of these is the Emu shear that hosts the Warunga deposit, which I'll show some photos of, and Redeemer and Crusader, but also I'll show you the Songvan pit as well. But first, I'll just show you some images of some of these shears that wrap around the granitic body. And they look like this. You basically have that's a roof pendant at the top of the granite, very shallow dipping, north dipping S1 foliation. It's quite well developed on the outer edges of the granite. As you go into the granite, that fabric disappears. So it's a fabric that's developed around the granite. And this is in the Wahroonga deposit. So basically, we're in the on the edge of the Scotty Creek Basin. It's actually developed in lake basin sediments. And what we see, the gold deposit at Wahroonga is hosted by these large layer parallel extensional shears. There's the compositional banding, very ductile fabrics, and I'm going to come back to this area later. But you see boudinage porphyry bodies, beautiful extensional shear kinematics, and loads of these recumbent folds that sort of dip out to the west, which is consistent with west side down or extensional kinematics. And up close, there's some more of those F1 folds. The folds trend north-south, like similar to F2 folds, but the actual planes are quite shallow and dip out to the west, so consistent with that west side down movement. And the mineralisation is hosted in a whole series of recrystallised quartz veins within these shears. But as I say, I'll come on to this later. To the south, here's another big D1 shear that's wrapping around the edge of the granite. And there's a beautiful big D1 shear. The gold sort of sits in this flat-lying shear. And within the shear in places, there's beautiful L1 stretching lineation. And a recent paper by Thibault et al. Have given us an age of 2661 on hydrothermal titanite that's aligned parallel to that L1 stretching lineation, which is really nice because it gives a direct age of this D1 shear. And there's the Songvan granite. This fabric wraps around the granite and sort of falls off on the western side. And up close, you can see the S1 foliation and those sort of recumbent folds similar to what we see at the Wahroonga deposit. Now, just up the ramp, that fabric is folded by these upright F2 folds. And the pit, at the entrance to the pit, there's the S1 foliation in basalts, and it's folded by upright F2 folds. So a very similar relationship to what we see at Leonora. And so the timing of D1, the D1 shears in the Agnew area obviously is very much helped by Thibault et al.'s age on the Songvan shear of 2661. And it's interesting because that's a similar age to the actual sediments in the lake basin. So it's sort of similar, again, similar in age to the lake basins. And now we go across to the Laverton district. Laverton has a series of large D1 shears that wrap around the Margaret Dome, and there's lovely extension shears in the Lancefield pit, and another large shear, Tet shear, forms the footwall to the Wallaby deposit. Another similar D1 shear dips back to the north, I guess sort of following, if you like, roughly the Kalgoorlie Dome. And there's another D1 shear that wraps along the eastern edge of the Hans Camp Syenite. I'll just show you what Tet shear looks like under Wallaby. It's a 500 metre wide myelinitic zone. It's quite incredible sized deposit. And we see beautiful extensional kinematics really in the really ductile fabrics within the shear zone. And basically Wallaby itself, it looks like this whole shear system is developed and then has been reactivated during strong compression to form the loads on these flats. And we know that Tet shear is an early structure because of Brett Davis's work, where he's actually seen peak metamorphic minerals overprinting that shear foliation. So this shear developed prior to peak metamorphism. And this is what it looks like. You go from a conglomerate to strongly flattened to this myelinite, where you can't tell any features anymore. And it's a really wide myelinitic zone. Now, timing of D1, of these D1 features, we know Tet shear is obviously developed in the Wallaby conglomerate, and it offsets porphyry bodies that are dated at about 2662, and it also overprints the Hans Camp Syenite, which is dated at 2664. So it's basically, we know it's actually sort of at a late stage of the formation of the lake basins, but again, it's a similar time to the lake basins. It's not a really early deformation event. It's quite late in the history. Now we go to the Kalgoorlie District. Very strongly overprinted by the D2 and D3 sort of east-west compression, but you can still see plenty of evidence for the early D1 deformation, with these large D1 shears wrapping around the large granite bodies. The most well-known, obviously, is the Fitzroy Fault below the Kanata Bell deposit. And I know Gerard Tripp describes a broad extensional tectonics there based on the offset of stratigraphy. But also we have these other extension of big shears, D1 shears, wrapping around these other granite bodies through here. Now, interestingly, we do have large D1 shears within the greenstone belts, like the Fayetteville Fault, the Foster Thrust, Tramways and Republican, and these are clearly thrust faults. There's good thrust reverse movements on these structures, but these structures we know are D1 because they are folded by upright F2 folds, and there is a large F1 recumbent fold above the Fayetteville Fault and in Carnelia Hill, and the stratigraphy there that's folded around that recumbent fold is folded by upright north trending F2 folds. So we're seeing that similar sort of relationship. And interestingly, there is early folding that's truncated by lake basin sediments of the Panglow Basin. Gerard Tripp describes this. And also there's down here in the Invincible deposit, the Black Flag mudstone is tilted prior to deposition of the Marugal Formation. And interestingly, at Invincible, the mineralized mudstone, there is an angular unconformity between the mineralized mudstone for the Invincible deposit and the overlying Marugal Formation. That is a sedimentary contact, and the alteration does not go up into the Marugal Formation. So it's a really good example of a mineralized system forming prior to the deposition of the Marugal Formation. And this is what it looks like underground. Very sharp contact. Intense alteration does not extend into the overlying Marugal Formation, but everything has been very tightly folded. You can see the tightly folded veins here, and that's very strong foliation. That's the S2 foliation coming through the Marugal Formation. So it's evidence of some deformation and mineralization, in this case, occurring prior to deposition of the lake basins. And that's similar to what we see up north in the Pigwell Graben, where the Pigwell Graben truncates folds in the underlying sequence. I'll just say timing here. We've got, we know we've got D1 shears and overprinting the Grave Dam member with the 2668 Grave Dam member, and also F1 folds are seen in the Lakewood Day site. So again, it's a similar timing to what we've seen in the other areas. And the final place I'll just take you to is down here on near the southeastern edge of the Yilgarn Craton, down at the Ardilla. And here again we see beautiful F1 recumbent folds and a layer parallel foliations folded by upright F2 folds, such as here. Here's an F2 fold here, and that early L1 stretching lineation folded about the upright F2 folds. And here's another refolded folds in the muds here. And interestingly, actually this is classic, just up the road, there's your typical upright F2 folds with a strong S2 cleavage and bedding, and S1 basically folded about the F2 folds, and in the thin section, you really clearly see the S1 fabric folded by those upright folds. A really consistent pattern between D1 and the later deformation. And just up the bank from this outcrop, there was a porphyry body, and that strong stretching lineation extends right through the porphyry body, and we've got an age on that porphyry at 2666, which is the same age as the Mount Belcher's Formation, which is also part of that lake basin sequence. So we're seeing deformation where we've got the actual ages at the end of the lake basin deposition. But obviously deformation is starting before the lake basins are deposited. So we're seeing the D1 event is broadly coeval with the lake basins, and both the lake basins and the D1 fabrics are overprinted by that strong east-west compression with those F2 folds. So we need a mechanism to explain that rapid uplift and exhumation of the granites to supply the granite clasts into the lake basins. So previous models suggest uplift and dome formation by compression during amalgamation of the terranes, but there was a lack of significant deformation prior to the formation of the lake basins. We don't see the schist clasts and gneiss clasts, and there's no tilting of the older sequence prior to deposition of the younger sequences. So we need an alternate mechanism. And so when I was sort of doing the study, I basically went to, I grabbed all of the structural data off the GSWA sheets, and I classified foliation data into 3 groups. Anything that was sort of steep and northwest to north trending, I classified as S2. Anything that was layer parallel and at a high angle to that dominant trend, I labelled S1. And there was a few local zones of steep northeast trending cleavages and foliations, which were only very local, so I'm not showing them on these maps. And the other thing I show on these maps is, so I've shown, so these foliation trends are just, the trajectories are based on all the structural data that I have underlying these. So the red dashed lines are the S1 foliation, and the fine black are the S2 foliation. And I've sort of shown the F1 fold hinges in green, and the other thing is the younging directions in blue, those arrows. And you can see the younging directions typically face away from the granitic bodies. And that's a pattern that we see right through the Eastern Goldfields. And as you can see, lots of early S1 fabrics well preserved in the Leonora area. As we go down to the Kalgoorlie area, you'll see that the dominant fabric here is the S2 foliation. You can see there's a lot of structural readings, and it's the dominant fabric through here. But you can still see areas where S1 is dominant, especially in the lee of these granite bodies. So we're seeing through that, basically the D2 deformation in D2 strain shadows, like in the lee of the granites and in large F1 fold hinges. And that's the only place you can sort of understand what's happening prior to that strong compression. So the key features, I think, that are related to D1, we said the major shears around the granite bodies, we see extensional kinematics on these shears, but we see reverse movement on the D1 shears within the greenstone belts. The D1 shears are typically younger, even sort of up to 10 million years younger than the underlying granite bodies. So they're not related to emplacement of the granite, but they are solid state fabrics related to granite-up, greenstone-down displacement. The greenstone sequences typically face away from the granitic complexes, and the youngest rocks are typically in the central parts of the greenstone belts. And we see the similar pattern of metamorphic facies throughout the Eastern Goldfields, where the highest metamorphic grades wrap around the granite domes, the lowest metamorphic facies sit in the centre of the greenstone belts. And I think that these key features that we see all over the Eastern Goldfields suggest the best model for formation of the Eastern Goldfields is gravity inversion, density inversion, or collapse of thickened crust. And that gives you the granite-up, greenstone-down tectonics. And I'll just show you in a sort of series of cartoons. As the granites start to rise up, we've piled a thick layer of ultramafic and mafic material onto a felsic crust. So the heavy, dense material wants to go down, and the light material starts to come up. As the greenstones are going down, there is a space accommodation problem, and we start to see accommodation shears, these thrust faults developing in the central parts of the greenstone belts. And we see these very ductile fabrics, the recumbent folds sliding off the rising granites. Then with continued uplift, and we've exhumed the granites, so they're exposed, and the detritus erodes into the still subsidence. So we're forming these lake basins or depo-centres within the greenstone belts. And this is where we're starting to see angular unconformities at the base of the lake basins, because we've already tilted and folded the underlying sequences, and then we deposit these lake basins on top of that. And then we have that strong east-west compression, and we fold everything. And in the Kalgoorlie area, I'll just show you this cartoon. They are to scale, but I think what we're seeing is the Karawang Formation, the Marugal Basin here, Panglow Basin, Penny Dam Conglomerate, all these coarse-grained sort of lake basins. And then down here, we've got Mount Belcher's Formation, which is predominantly mudstones and sandstones, very different to these, but they're all the same age. So I think what we're seeing is proximal versus distal. And then, of course, we compress everything, and this is where we've just left these remnant synclines, tightly folded synclines here in the Penny Dam, Panglow, and Karawang. And then we've got the border, again, we've got the infolded Mount Belchers, but that's a nice broad zone of lake basin sediments. So that's what the current day looks like. So in summary, I think a gravity inversion model or granite-up, greenstone-down tectonics allows uplift of granite domes without significant deformation in the overlying greenstone sequences, and it preserves those younging directions away from the domes. Then subsequent D2 or 3 deformation modifies the established dome and basin geometry with D1 fabrics preserved in the D2 strain shadows. And the timing of D1 is broadly coeval with the lake basin formation. And at around 2650, there was the shift from dominantly vertical tectonics to horizontal tectonics, and that coincides with the end of the sedimentary record in the Eastern Goldfields and the change from the high calcium to the low calcium granites. And this model suggests that the Eastern Goldfields did not develop by accretionary tectonics. Now, if we just have a look at gold deposits, we know from geochronology studies that we've got a broad range in ages of gold deposits from around 2670 to 2635. And some of these gold deposits have developed during the D1 event. And the structural controls on these early gold deposits differs markedly from the more typical orogenic gold deposits formed during the horizontal compression. And a really good example I can show you is in the Agnew camp here. And we'll just go into the Agnew district. And I'm going to show you these two deposits. They're both hosted in the lake basin sediments. We've got the Wahroonga deposit here that's hosted in the Emu shear, the extensional shear. And then I've got the New Holland deposit here. And they're only 2 k's apart, these deposits, in the same host rocks and at the same RL, but the difference in style, structural style of these deposits, the chalk and cheese. Here's the Wahroonga deposit, and that's hosted in these extensional shears, the layer parallel. We have boudinage porphyries, highly ductile conditions. We go across to the New Holland deposit. There's upright folded beds and these flat-lying, very brittle lodes just cut straight across the beds. So extremely different. And looking at a sort of a cross-section through this area, there's the Wahroonga deposit, and the layer parallel Emu shear sort of runs down the side of the basin. And the New Holland deposit is actually hosted in subvertical beds in a siliciclastic sandstone unit with flat lodes through here. And and also upright F2 folds overprint the features of Wahroonga, and also the whole basin is folded during that F folding event. And this is what we see at Wahroonga. We've got the slight toffee, basically the mineralised veins are folded and basically showing west side down kinematics or extensional kinematics. We see these sort of features. The gold is hosted in strongly recrystallised quartz veins. But away from the shear, you still see clasts. That's an actual chert clast. So the deformation is very local within the shear zone. It's not like the whole shear zone is destroyed. It has destroyed the sediments. And in contrast, so that was at Wahroonga. In contrast at New Holland, we've basically got these folded beds and loads, just very brittle style, just cutting across the beds. This is more typical of the Eastern Goldfields orogenic gold coming in with horizontal compression. So what we're seeing is an early gold event, and we know from Thabau et al.'s paper that we've got a direct age on a D1 shear around about 2661, which is similar in age to the lake basin sediments. But then we have this much younger mineralising event, which is due to east-west compression and that very brittle style of gold deposition. So that's basically where I finish. Just hopefully got questions.